So as you hopefully noticed if you've been following along, I do try to be geographically diverse and include regions of the world that tend to get overlooked, at least as far as LGBT history goes. Unfortunately, this also means sometimes I'm strapped for resources, even secondary academic works. And occasionally I'm left with a balancing act between telling the stories I'd like to tell and making sure I can tell them with respect and accuracy, or at least reasonable accuracy. All of this is to say there really isn't much out there on medieval Korean history in English or French, the two languages I can read. Plus, I can't read modern Korean even if I could easily access books by Korean historians about their own history, which I can't. So I wanted to highlight the fact that one of my two main sources was a blog post, written by a fan of historical dramas who knows Korean and actually has read some of the primary sources. Even more importantly than talking about my source limitations for this topic, I just wanted to make sure I highlighted and promoted her work, especially since it's not an exaggeration that I wouldn't be able to do this video at all without using her posts as a resource. So be sure to check it out. Anyway, in ancient Korea, male homosexuality at least had a place in the culture of the ruling class. Not entirely unlike chivalry in medieval Europe, the hwarang of ancient Korea were men recruited from the nobility to serve as warriors. Unlike the knights of Europe, though, they also often wrote homoerotic poetry. I'll probably cover them in their own episode sometime. I just wanted to establish that Korea had a homoerotic tradition that stretched back many centuries. But by the 15th century, under the Joseon dynasty that would rule Korea until 1910, attitudes toward homosexuality became harsher. Part of this was the influence of Confucianism, which had become the dominant ideology of the noble class and the country's civil servants. Confucianism's emphasis on family, especially the importance of a son who would continue the family line, encouraged a view that homosexuality was a threat to the future of any family. By the time of the Joseon dynasty, hwarang had gone from being a term that denoted respect and honor to a slur with connotations of laziness, sexual promiscuity, witchcraft, and, yes, homosexuality. Nonetheless, Korea never saw a campaign to outlaw same-sex acts. In fact, traveling male prostitutes were still tolerated as part of everyday life, even if they weren't exactly socially respectable. And there were traditional shamans respected by their communities, who were also believed to enter same-sex relationships. Problems arose if someone chose to have a lover of the same sex, at the expense of their obligation to have sons that would continue their line. Although less is known, at least through the sources I have, about female same-sex love in pre-modern Korea, the principle was basically the same. Lesbian love was allowed, but it was seen as, if anything, practice for a woman until she was ready to be married and have children. At least among the upper classes, it became much more of an oddity, if not an outright social threat, if a woman continued sleeping with other women after marriage. That brings us to a story that begins with Yi Yang, the eldest son of King Sejong, who would later inherit the throne under the reign name Moonjong. As King Sejong's official heir, his marriage was a serious matter of state, as you might expect. A bride was selected through a rigorous selection process, which would see eligible women from all the nobility gathered together and examined under three criteria: their family lineage, their virtue according to Confucian sensibilities, and, of course, their looks. Yet the first wife selected for the crown prince would quickly prove a catastrophe. Named Yi, the woman who would prove to be only Yi's first princess consort, was a daughter of the Andong Kim clan, who could trace their ancestry back to the old Silla royal dynasty of ancient Korea. Presumably, she also won the looks category. But despite her qualities, she had problems gaining the affection of the crown prince. who kept spending his nights with 2 female servants. So Hui allegedly turned to witchcraft. Aided by her servant Ho Cho, Hui tried out various spells, including burning the shoes of her romantic rivals and wearing a cloth soaked in the body fluids of a snake. Of course, it's hard to keep any secrets in an environment as claustrophobic as a royal court, much less experiments in the occult. When King Sejong found out about Princess Hui's unorthodox approach to her and his son's love life, he had Ho Cho beheaded. Hui was protected from a death sentence by her class privilege, but she hardly got what I think most people would describe as a slap on the wrist. She lost her place as crown princess and was banished from the royal court. She and her father were demoted to the status of commoner. Her brother lost his cushy government job, and her name was erased from her family's ancestral shrine. At this point, I should mention we know all of these details because they were meticulously detailed in one of the most invaluable primary sources in all of world history, the veritable records of the Joseon dynasty. Originally written in classical Chinese, these records ran continuously from 1392 to 1865, covering not just events at the royal court, but diplomatic, cultural, meteorological, and economic happenings. While the earliest records were handwritten, most would be printed using movable type, the same hot new technology that would be spontaneously developed 78 years later in Europe by a German goldsmith, Johannes Gutenberg. The writers of the records actually did their best to be independent from royal influence, especially after early on one of the kings had the historian executed for writing unflattering details into the accounts. The historians also were dedicated to being thorough, so much so that another king was enraged when he discovered one of the historians was following him around on a hunting trip in disguise. No, really. The National Institute of Korean History digitized the complete collection and translated it into modern Korean. Currently, they're working on an English version, but this isn't expected to be finished for another decade or so. And they haven't gotten to the part that covers the material for this episode. Hence my dependence on the talking cupboard. Anyway, let's get back on track. Following the love spell scandal, the royal family was understandably a little cagey about selecting a new crown princess. Eventually, in 1429, a few months after Hui was demoted and banished, they picked a woman from the Hahn clan, who was named Crown Princess Sook. To avoid another scandal, she was given a female teacher, who would instruct her on proper virtues. She was even given homework, having to read the biographies of exemplary women. Shockingly, all of these precautions didn't work. In no small part because the crown prince was up to his old ways of keeping company with female servants and royal concubines. When one of the concubines gave birth to a male heir before she could, Princess soon lied about having a miscarriage, in an attempt to avoid the embarrassment that would come from a concubine getting pregnant before she did. One can only imagine the intense social pressure to produce an heir, as well as the fact that, as crown princess, she would bear the blame for failing in her duty to have children. No wonder then that Hui had resorted to her servants' occult tricks, and why soon apparently became an alcoholic, at least according to the veritable records. Quote, "Her temperament is of one who enjoys drinking and prepares to drinks in her room. She also likes drinking using big bowls one after another, and getting drunk on top of that. There are times when she would force her female attendants to carry her on their back and walk her around the palace. When she deems the alcohol insufficient, she would personally go back to her parents' residence just to bring back the drinks to her palace and drink it." Booze wasn't the princess's only source of comfort. She had also fallen in love with Sejong, one of her servants who came from the Nobi, a low-ranking caste similar to the serfs of Russia. In her own testimony to the court as recorded by the veritable records, Sejong tried to distance herself from the princess, implying that she was essentially only following orders. Yet the two were inseparable. Other servants would be locked out of the princess's chambers, while the two would sleep together. Sejong even described Soon as lying next to her, like a man would lie next to a woman. Again, rumors pretty quickly spread since Soon made no attempt to disguise her love affair. One day when Sejong was cleaning, the crown prince approached her and asked her flat out if she was sleeping with Soon. Shocked, the servant admitted as much, but the crown prince did nothing. In fact, it seems that the two women continued sleeping together for some time, until once again it was up to King Sejong to interfere. In November of 1436, he issued a proclamation bemoaning how badly the last two crown princesses turned out, and declared, quote, "This is brought upon by both the crown prince and I, who lack proper control of the household." Like her spell-casting predecessor, Soon lost her royal status, was demoted to a commoner, and was banished from the royal capital. However, the official reason for her demotion and her banishment was given as just the fact that she allegedly sent clothes provided by the royal palace back to her family, and that she had once received a relative without the knowledge or permission of her husband. Horror of horrors, I know. Meanwhile, Sejong and his son just gave up and decided to promote one of the concubines, Gwan, to the status of royal princess. However, Gwan died of an infection just 2 days after giving birth. Perhaps feeling cursed in the marriage department, or deciding he was better off just sticking with concubines, especially now that he had his heir. The crown prince never married again, even after he became king. As for Soon, well, we quite simply don't know what happened to her. The instant she stopped being useful to the people in power, she disappears from the annals of history, leaving behind only an unhappy story of a woman who could only find comfort in forbidden love, and in the end was not even allowed that.